I'm Emma Knudson, and yeah, a little bit, I'm just gonna dive into that background a little bit. Since many of you have just met me for the first time, I'm a rising senior this year at the University of Missouri, big landlocked Midwest gal. I grew up in Illinois, I go to school in Missouri, and I received this Hollings fellowship, which involves an internship as part of the award. And we got to kind of interview and pick and choose some different areas for our internship. And when I was looking, I told my parents, I was like, I'm getting as far away from the Midwest as possible. And they were like, you know what? We get that. And yeah, the coast was just a very unexplored place for me. So being able to come to Maine has felt like such a huge blessing and such a joy. So that's how I ended up here. Because that's really the first question is people are like, okay, Midwest, why are you here? And I'm like, why wouldn't I be? But I study environmental science and education at the zoo. And yes, I've been working on this project. But we're gonna get to that. This is also at the end, I plan on leaving quite a bit of time for questions or conversation or ideas that you guys want to share. So feel free to write any down or be thinking about that. I definitely want this to feel like, an open space to chat about this. So here's my project, measuring cultural ecosystem services experienced by volunteers in coastal Maine.
Sorry, do that.
Oh, all good. My clickers, it's all right. Maybe I need to redo this clicker thing. And if not, we'll use the computer. That works too. Computer it is. Okay. Well, here's a brief outline. I'm going to give you guys all a little bit of background information, the objectives, methods, results of the research, all the, meat and potatoes, and then some conclusion and some next steps and thank yous. And I would like to begin by having you all take a second, look at this image, and reflect on how it makes you feel. Okay, so hopefully maybe just a few seconds to think of the first word or phrase that comes to mind. And if you look at this image and felt relaxed or inspired by the beauty of the waterfall, or maybe thought about it'd be so much fun to take a nice hike with friends to get there, all of those feelings are examples of cultural ecosystem services, which are more formally defined as the non-material and intangible benefits that people receive from being out in nature. Okay, Emma, why do I care? Well, raise your hand if any of you guys have been outside for more than 30 seconds in the past 2 weeks. Yeah, I like that. Okay, some reserve goers. Well, lucky you. You too yourself can receive all of the incredible benefits of cultural ecosystem services, which have a broad range. Some examples here include spiritual enrichment, cultural value, social relations, and kind of friendships, education, recreation, aesthetics, overall well-being, contributing to identity, and even things like subsistence, such as I am a researcher and I work outside, so thank goodness there's outdoors for me to go work in, right? And the other awesome benefit is that research has shown that cultural ecosystem services can contribute to us greatly as humans, including improving our overall well-being by having influences on us both physically and mentally. Cultural ecosystem services are also thought to inform people's held preferences and values. And as environmentalists, we really care about that because we can take that information and say, okay, if we can influence the cultural ecosystem services that people receive, that can potentially have consequences for how we convince people to care about the environment. You receive all these incredible benefits, so you should feel motivated to protect it, which so many of you in this room do feel inclined to do. Our goal is to hopefully spread that incredible range across the population. So you all know where you're at. This was more for all the Hollings people who are like, but for a little bit more context, the Wells Reserve is part of this national collection of estuarine research reserves, which makes up a system of 30 different locations across the United States. And there are 3 key goals associated with this system, including education, long-term research and monitoring, and coastal stewardship. just a little bit more context as to how this fits into the big picture. And why did we study volunteers? Well, to put it simply, volunteers are the lifeblood of the Wells Reserve. The Wells Reserve simply would not be without all of you. So we have over 250 returning volunteers annually, as you all know, taking part in a broad range of different roles across the reserve, many volunteers taking part in multiple roles. And cumulatively, volunteers donate over 15,000 hours annually to the Wells Reserve to keep their programs as effective and efficient as possible, making it an extremely important subpopulation to start to analyze since you're such a key part of this experience. So our research itself circled around two key questions. What cultural ecosystem services do Wells Reserve volunteers receive from their work in an estuarine environment? And then what impact those services have, both on you, the volunteers, the community, and the reserve as a whole. So some methods. How did we do this? Well, to start, this was a mixed methods research project, which essentially means we were analyzing qualitative and quantitative research and data. So words and numbers. Woohoo! And project development began actually in early January when I came to visit the Wells Reserve for the first time. We had a full research team meeting where we just kind of set up some framework, and the Wells Reserve team developed the survey and sent it to the volunteers. So that was most of the spring. By mid-March, that was completed. And at that time, I was also working with something called an institutional review board with my university, which just means I did all the training and all the, things to make sure that I was using human data safely. So I don't have any of your information. I'm not sharing any of that information, and the IRB knows it. And I got that number even. But that survey that was developed contained 13 questions. 4 were qualitative and 9 were quantitative. So the quantitative questions focused on demographic information, as well as 5 cultural ecosystem services that the reserve wanted to measure specifically on a Likert scale, which is essentially like multiple choice, but with numbers, and we can kind of do some analysis with that. So that's an example of our quantitative question. And qualitative questions were just these open-ended short essay response questions, and we took that data to be analyzed. And speaking of analysis, so we had 92 survey responses out of 127 volunteers that the survey was sent to, which is awesome. Thank you all for checking your emails and making my life super easy. It's a really great response rate in research. And the Likert scale questions, we just ran some general statistics in Excel on, and then the open-ended questions were coded in a qualitative software known as MaxQDA. I don't know what that stands for. I don't think it's an acronym. It's a German company. And to kind of dig into that a little bit and give you some more context, what qualitative coding is. So when we hear the word coding, we often think of computer language and lots of letters and numbers on a black background. And based on the way that I'm describing it, you all can probably tell that that is not my area of expertise. Qualitative coding is a little bit different. It's essentially systematically breaking down large pieces of information into smaller bite-sized pieces, and then giving those little pieces labels. And we call those labels codes. So I've put up a little example from a volunteer survey here and attached the codes that I had coded into it, just to give you guys a little bit more context. So I coded all 92 surveys twice. First, I did it inductively to determine what themes were present, and then I used those themes to create a code book. And I used that code book to deductively code for a second time. So really digging into this, first determining what was in the surveys, and then saying, okay, I think I'm seeing some patterns. Let's really dive into the nuance of those patterns. So this is crazy. I'm not going to explain all this, but so you understand more of what a code book is. We had, let's see if this laser. Yeah, okay. So for the code book, we had 6 what we call parent codes or big themes. And you can see them up top, like custom codes. Another one that we had was social relations. Another one was sense of place. And then within those bigger themes, we coded some sub-themes, such as these. And then you can see on this side how many times that code showed up in surveys. So this is just to kind of give, again, a little more background information. Here's the second half of my code book. I won't explain the whole thing, but just so you all get a sense of how many themes there were. And the results, the fun part. First with quantitative. So to break down some of the demographic information, we asked volunteers how long they had been volunteering here. And as we see, we got a pretty good breakup, but a majority of our volunteers, so over 50%, were in this 1 to 6 year range category, which is really awesome. A lot of you guys are, just starting to get your feet wet. But we also have quite a few that have been here for 20 or more years. So kudos to y'all. That's really impressive. But we were glad to see this really good breakdown. We also saw a really nice even breakdown in volunteer role distribution. So out of all 14 roles, we had them all represented at least one time. We asked volunteers, how many roles do you take part in? Many of you said multiple, but we also asked, the question was at the bottom here, which role is most meaningful to you? So that was how we created this graph to kind of determine where our breakdown was. We definitely see some roles with a little bit more, such as facilities, admissions booth, and rangers, kind of taking up a bigger portion of our data. And then more of a breakdown. So for my statistics people, all of our averages were statistically significant. If you can see those tiny little lines, that's our error bar, if you can believe that. A little crazy. But we had a very high overall positive sentiment across all cultural ecosystem services, which is wonderful that you feel so strongly about these things in a positive way. But just to point out a few things, our two highest averages were at 4.7, which is fulfilling stewardship, and right behind it at 4.67 was physical and mental well-being, kind of giving us an idea that volunteers are feeling really satisfied in their stewardship roles, as well as are feeling that overall improvement to their well-being based on those results. Now we get into the qualitative, which is the more, meat and potatoes of it all. Another really scary graph that I'm not going to explain the whole thing to you all, but again, to give you a nice sense of how those codes were broken up into a more visual way. So we had 555 codes total across all of the surveys. They were broken up into those 6 big themes that you kind of heard me talking about already. That's demonstrated by those thicker purple lines. The thickness of the lines is also related to how many codes were in that category. So as we see, our biggest section was that physical and mental well-being with 155, so we see the biggest portion. And you can kind of see it broken up into those sub-themes. So we're basically just trying to explain the nuance of these survey responses. There was a lot of information, wonderful information in them, and we can kind of see it broken up a little bit in this way. Some themes obviously kind of sticking out more than others, where we see those thicker lines. But that's also what we're going to get into right now. So we're going to break down 6 qualitative themes today. I've kind of broken it up into our parent codes. So we'll see improved quality of life, people matter, part of something bigger, purpose-driven work, sense of place, and education and discovery as our main themes that we'll be breaking up. Starting with improved quality of life. Okay, so overall, we saw both in the quantitative and the qualitative data that physical and mental well-being was the highest average coded theme out of all of our surveys. 28% of the codes that we identified had this theme in it, and 56.5% of volunteers mentioned this theme at least once in their survey. So I've created this word cloud to kind of give you all a visual to look at the different adjectives that were being used to describe the impact that this work had on volunteers. But some more specific examples that we pulled out as themes were the work adding purpose and meaning to volunteers' lives, the reserve being a peaceful and spiritually restoring place, volunteers feeling valued and appreciated through their work, and then others just saying that staying busy, active, and outside was good for them both physically and mentally. And we can see a lot of those themes kind of coming out in like meaningful, useful, social, other things like more physical descriptions there, special, beautiful. They kind of fall into those categories where we see, oh, this might be describing the place, this might be describing the relationships, this maybe is describing the overall individual experience of I feel good and wonderful and great. People matter. One of my favorite themes. So overall, we saw that social relations was a really important part of why volunteers had such a positive experience at the reserve. And we see three sub-themes within this overall theme, starting with the volunteer community. So the reserve has created an extremely welcoming group of volunteers. Volunteers mention strong friendships, feeling more connected, and having a group of people with like-minded values and goals, all being an important part of these relationships. So we see one really amazing example of this impact here with a volunteer who said the Wells Reserve has been a constant source of community. People truly support each other. I feel a sense of belonging that is both rare and special. The next sub-theme that we're going to dive into is the importance of supportive staff, which was mentioned directly by so many volunteers, saying specifically that the support appreciation they feel is some of the best they've received and a large reason why they return year after year. So as one volunteer said, I've never volunteered for an organization that values its volunteers as much and shows its appreciation as well as the Wells Reserve, which can be an important takeaway when thinking about how to improve these programs, thinking about the importance of that leadership showing up and taking the time to express the importance of this community. And lastly, impacts on visitors. So many volunteers work among the public and interact with visitors directly on a day-to-day basis, and many said that that was an extremely important part of their experience, such as this volunteer who said that they feel energized, peaceful, and grateful for the opportunity to interact with people who come to experience the Wells Reserve. This is a really interesting finding because it's specific to volunteer work. And we also see this beginning relationship being formed where obviously, we know the volunteers are positively impacting the visitors by being a friendly face, a source of information. But now we're seeing this kind of back and forth where the visitors are also impacting the volunteers positively, which is something we'll continue to talk about. Our next qualitative theme is part of something bigger. So we had this under the parent theme of identity. The two biggest themes that were pulled out of this CES was the work itself adding purpose and meaning to volunteers' lives, and this being part of a big picture that was the title of our theme and was really said a lot directly in surveys. So some examples of this in quotation: volunteering gives me something meaningful in my life. And another quotation saying that I feel that I'm part of a much larger operation and helping to further big goals. This can of course have individual impacts, but it also integrates volunteers as a critical component to larger environmental missions. And if this becomes an important part of who volunteers are and what their identity is, we can maybe see these sort of themes and impacts being sustained long term. Our next qualitative theme is purpose-driven work, which was pulled from the parent theme of fulfilling stewardship. So some really awesome example quotations here. But the main examples that we see in fulfilling stewardship with volunteers is that they have this foundational value and belief in the reserve mission. They also have a foundational want to simply protect natural environments. And the impact of this service can contribute to the reserve by motivating groups of people to contribute to long-term reserve projects and the overall reserve mission. But this also has important implications for the community by allowing the reserve to continually provide a place to enjoy these environments and educational opportunities. So we see how this fulfilling stewardship not only contributes to volunteers' sense of work and that purpose that we talked about, but also giving back to the reserve and the community at large, making it one of our broadest qualitative themes impacting nearly everybody that takes part in these activities. Sense of place being our fifth qualitative theme. So some themes that we pulled out of the sense of place parent code was that the reserve makes people happy and is a special place for a lot of people, and that through the work of volunteering, volunteers feel more connected to the reserve. Such as this first quotation on the bottom left, saying that the reserve itself is amazing and volunteering gives me a connection that I wouldn't get as an occasional visitor. And then alternatively, we see that the role that the reserve plays in making volunteers happy. I feel humbled and spiritually enriched when I'm at the reserve. It's one of my most treasured places to be. So those are some more specific examples, but we can also see how this can maybe develop into a theme of the reserve becoming a more important part of the community. If we establish long-term relationships with a specific place, we do work here, we make friends here, we feel fulfilled here, all of a sudden the reserve is no longer just a reserve, a nature reserve. It's part of a relationship and now contributing back to the people who go out into Wells and coastal Maine, becoming a more integrated part of our experience here. Next, we're going to dive into custom codes, which was a very broad and most diverse parent theme. It included many other cultural ecosystem services that we didn't want to dive into specifically, but if they emerged from the data, we said, oh, okay, we're going to pull that one out there and we're going to also analyze that. There were also a few other themes that came up as patterns in this data, such as we created a sub-theme called the importance in retirement. Many volunteers mentioned that, this gives me an opportunity to get out of the house and meet some people and do some important work in retirement. So we decided to code that as well. But to dive into some of the biggest overall themes in our custom codes section, an emergent theme of this was education and scientific discovery, which once again, I felt was extremely important to pull out because it's unique to the volunteer experience. Volunteers contribute directly to research projects, helping collect and analyze data. You serve as docents, rangers, and guides across the reserve. And this is extremely important, not only to the reserve, but a highly specialized role. So seeing the impacts of it is really incredible, such as this top quotation, volunteers saying that they've gained a professional network and the research that they conducted launched their career. So this was a research, a volunteer who did outdoor research, like data collection. So we see that incredible relationship being built. And then this bottom quotation was a docent saying, I consider myself a lifelong learner, and their volunteer work as a docent has resulted in the opportunity for them to learn many new things, both from the staff, scientists, and other docents and volunteers. So not only does this have a lot of individual impacts as volunteers are able to learn, which is an incredible thing to keep doing, obviously well into our lives, but furthermore, it also establishes intergenerational knowledge that's tied to this place specifically. So this can create some long-lasting understanding and desire to protect the natural environment that volunteers dedicate so much time to express to the public. Another custom code that I wanted to kind of dive into today was a CES known as the Quest, which is essentially defined as leaving legacies. And we see that come through in two different ways, leaving a legacy of natural environmental areas, as well as a legacy of education. So to start, I think that this is an extremely important CES to dive into because it goes to show that volunteers will always be a part of the story of the Wells Reserve. The legacy that they've worked to create and are continuing to leave will be seen for generations to come. And we see this expressed through a few different quotations, such as a volunteer who said that they felt they've left a better world to be left for future generations by helping to protect this environment. And we also see this through the work of education, as we educate the environmentalists and sustainability leaders of the next generation, such as this volunteer who said that they love to inspire scientific curiosity and awareness of the interconnected nature of our world, and that this inspires them to live life more fully. So a kind of new finding that we're going to dive into, never before seen slides, you're the first to see it. It's also very preliminary. So we can't say these things for sure, obviously, but it's, I think, a really interesting thing to dive into as we talk about cultural ecosystem services is their relationships. So I've begun to dive into like the literature and the research a little bit more. And as we better understand cultural ecosystem services, researchers are beginning to say that these things are not happening single-handedly. I'm not a volunteer, I show up to the Wells Reserve and I meet my friend and I say, that's what I receive here. I just make friends and that's it. Or I just help with research and I contribute to education and that's it. These things are not mutually exclusive. They're very interconnected. And they happen, different cultural ecosystem services happen at the same time. So kind of understanding where those relationships lie is something that I found really interesting and want to share with you all. So we're going to be diving into this graph a little bit. This like half, I am going to go over, so just forget about it, okay? It's like all over here. The red squares are examples of where there was more relationship. So what I mean by code relations, this chart was created in the software that we used to do the coding. So the software pulled places where, let's say, I coded a custom code. And then next to it, I coded this code, which I'll explain because I know they're cut off. But if that code frequency happened within the same paragraph, that's where this number was pulled from. So these codes are happening within like the same sentences, the same paragraphs of a single survey response. So we can see how they're maybe experienced by the same volunteer and in the same way. So we're going to be focusing on all of these red squares, and like the purpley squares are where we see more relationship. And these blue ones, we see them happen occasionally, but for sake of time, I'm not going to explain the whole thing. To start at the bottom here, where we see relationships to this cultural ecosystem service of identity, this code to the left, where we see 10 different instances of them happening in the same paragraph, is titled Making an Environmental Impact. So obviously we know that volunteers contribute positively to different environmental projects, which can become an important part of volunteer identity. So as I explained in the fulfilling stewardship theme, this was a foundational value of many different volunteers. I want to contribute to environmental sustainability goals. So we can see that relationship of if they feel they want to make an environmental impact and they work towards those goals, it becomes an important part of who they are. The second relationship that I find extremely interesting is that identity was frequently coded with feeling valued and appreciated. So if a volunteer, an example of this could be a volunteer saying, I come to the reserve and people tell me all the time how important this work is, and I feel like a valued part of this work. All of a sudden, that work is now becoming part of who they are. I feel proud of this work. I'm a part of something bigger. Is an important relationship that I think we can obviously continue to dive into. This is all very preliminary, but seeing that really high relationship between those two things, pretty interesting. Moving right along up the list, physical and mental well-being. So the work contributes positively to my mental health. That's what that top of the column is saying, where it gets cut off. So volunteers often said that not only did the work contribute positively, but there were some sub-themes that they mentioned specifically, such as I feel valued and helpful. That is contributing to the positive feelings that I experience here, and also being active and outside. A pretty typical relationship that we would expect to see. And then here in this like little box, the top of that column is titled The Work Gives Me Purpose and Adds Meaning to My Life. So we kind of started to dive into that just on the previous slide. When volunteers, feel appreciated, contributing to their mental health and their overall satisfaction and well-being, all of a sudden the work is giving them more purpose. Moving right along into fulfilling stewardship. So on the left side, the top of that column is the code, the reserve is special, beautiful, and meaningful. So we can see this connection between sense of place and the volunteers feeling like they're making a difference in that place, which is what that fulfilling stewardship piece is. So not only are they more connected to the reserve, they're now understanding its positive impact that they're creating. And then another really strong relationship that we identified on the right side is the feeling helpful, valued, and appreciated. So essentially what this relationship could mean is that when volunteers are told that they're important, when they're told that the work they're doing is impactful, it helps them feel more fulfilled and sure of themselves that the work they're doing is contributing positively to the world around them. To jump right up, we're going to skip sense of place. There wasn't really anything super strongly related there. But in the social relations category, a lot of relationships were present in volunteers saying that they were making friendships, they were feeling more connected, they were had lots of positive interactions with visitors, and this contributed to their mental health. So we can begin to understand that social relations is an important part of a positive experience as a volunteer. Some conclusions. Wow, Emma, that was like so many words. I'm really confused. That was a lot of relationships. There's so many cultural ecosystem services. What does it all mean? Well, I don't know if I have that like great answer, but we have a few key takeaways. So one thing that really emerged a lot through the data was that these positive experiences are due to the specialized work that volunteers get to do. They have the opportunity to do. So studying these groups more is really interesting as we understand different volunteers at different reserves might do different work. So they might experience different services. We also see the overall impact, both on an individual scale, where volunteers say, I've made friends, and wow, I've improved my well-being, but we also see it on a community-wide scale. The way these services and this work improves both the reserve and can also extend into the community at large. Some more takeaways. Volunteers give a lot. You give a lot of time and energy and commitment, but you also receive a lot in return, which is really awesome. And the beginning of this theme known as reciprocity. Shout out to Chris for showing me all these incredible research projects looking at this. So not something that we're going to dive into as a result today, but something that we'll be continuing to look at is this, rather than a back and forth relationship of, I'm outside and I receive these benefits, it's I'm outside and I receive these things, what do I give back? And all of a sudden it's this beautiful circle. And also using these results to improve on volunteer programs. So this can be applied hopefully to many different places, not only looking in ways we can increase these positive benefits that people receive, but also looking at ways we can help recruit and retain volunteers, not only at the reserve here in Wells, but at reserves across the country. Some next steps. Where are we going from here? I've only been here for 7 weeks. So if you know anything about research, that's kind of a really quick turnaround for anything super substantial. So I'll be continuing this in my senior year as an honors thesis, where I'll be diving more into qualitative codes, as well as analyzing potential differences between experience based on volunteer role and length of their volunteering service, as well as diving into those relationships that we started to look at today. Next steps beyond me, continuing to understand what this relationship of reciprocity looks like is a really interesting thing to begin to dive into. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System is also conducting a study at, I believe, 5 different reserves. Shout out if I'm wrong on that, any of my education team gang. But they're going to be looking at volunteers across the country and doing the same exact thing, essentially, analyzing cultural ecosystem services. And as I mentioned before, using this data and conducting more research to improve these programs. Some supplemental materials, my email, hunt me down, ask me a question, do whatever, just say, hey, that's like my personal email, what I'll have access to forever. And then this email I have access to until May, as well as my code book. This has all the codes as well as its definitions. So if you're really hoping to dive more into like, what was she doing? What does this all mean? This is a little more broken down into what we saw in the data. And I'll flip back to this, I promise. But I wanted to also send some big shout outs to you, the community and the volunteers who have not only helped make this reserve such a special place, but have made this research possible, period. I'm very grateful that you filled out the survey, that you all showed up and asked questions throughout the summer and were so supportive of me as I arrived here and have been working here. And to some of the education team, Suzanne Kahn, just being such a positive support throughout this summer, a true role model of an exceptional educator and leader. To Amanda Bailiff, my camp counselor coordinator, also her enthusiasm in just helping me pursue my educational goals. Chris Furt for supporting the research process and being an awesome storyteller, helping me discover what all of this means. And the entire education and outreach team for sitting at that cute little kitchen table with me and helping me figure all this out. I'm so very grateful to have had this experience with you all. And so you know I'm not lying, here are my references, a thank you, and let's chat. Any questions? And I'm gonna flip back to that QR code for anybody who wants to scan it. But yeah, I'm just happy to talk about it all. So thank you. Yes.
I'm interested in your extension to the wider community and where maybe some of the themes around that, and talk more about those. How do you think the wider community was affected or is affected by volunteering here? What would you kind of look at further to in that direction?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the two biggest themes that come to mind are fulfilling stewardship. So obviously, as we're taking care of this place sticks around, as well as the volunteers are a really critical part of that outreach and education piece. So the more volunteers we have working on these things, the more people know about them. It's, I guess, not only contributing to like the reserve mission of, coastal stewardship, how we draw people in. I think that relationship would be really important to dive into and how it affects the community at large, as well as sense of place, I think is something that comes up. I kind of mentioned it briefly, but we see as this place becomes important to people here and they bring it past that driveway, past that sign into the community and explain this is why the reserve is important to me, or this is why I believe the reserve is special. We can hopefully see that impact and that meaning brought to other people, drawing people in, as well as, again, the education and research piece of it all. Those projects affect the whole community. So I think that's those areas where I would say that relationship becomes a little bit more noticeable. But yeah.
Thanks. I really enjoyed your presentation and the work that's done here is obviously awesome. And I know a lot of people are going to say that. So someone who hasn't really worked with qualitative data or like survey-based data, you said that overall you had 555 different codes. Is that like 555 individual sentences or phrases you picked out, and that each of those was, further classified, or what does that mean?
Yes, that's exactly right. And if it's cool, I can leave this presentation. I have the software pulled up. I figured it might be something interesting if people had more questions about, to give you a little idea. No names, I promise. I'm not allowed to see any of those things. So an example, wow, this is an awesome response. Thank you to whoever did this. We have all these little highlights here. So this, can you see my mouse? Oh yeah, totally. So this survey had 12 codes, which are all of these on the side here. So some of the codes are like a sentence long. Some of them, like the one that was just highlighted, are a lot bigger and they involve a lot more. So yeah, these little tiny highlighted pieces here are all one code. And there were 555 of those.
And could the same phrase be classified as two different codes?
Yes, they overlap. It's crazy. So here's a great example. This sentence here provides me educational, highlight, educational, recreational opportunities, highlight, activity, and then in a natural setting. And I highlighted it as well for staying busy impacts my physical and mental health. So yes, it gets the example I put up there was easy because it was like little pieces of the sentence, but there's a lot of overlap. within surveys, within sentences. But yes. Yeah.
And you talked about there being 14 different roles that the volunteers fell into. Docents, facilities, etc. I haven't seen anything yet, and I'd be curious whether you saw anything that was distinctive about, did it matter what role people would fill? As in light of what type of responses they gave. Is there anything that characterizes one from the other, or is it just, is it a broad category of volunteering at Wells Reserve that is probably not this year?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's something I will be looking into more specifically. I'll give you some off the record, like what I think, because I definitely noticed those themes, which is why I thought, let's dive into it. Does length of service matter? Like, you know, I've been here for a year or I've been here for 20 years. Does that change things? And I'm a ranger, I'm a docent, I'm a, you know, visitor center. So in general, some things that stick out to me were folks in admissions booth and visitor center. The social relations piece was really big, as well as facilities. My assumption on those things, I'm not a, you know, someone could shout out and say like, here's my experience. The facilities team's really large, I would assume, and a lot of those people are here on a weekly basis, on a daily basis. So I would assume maybe those relationships are stronger. Admissions booth and visitor center mention a lot, like I get to interact with the public. It's so much fun to meet people from all across the world was mentioned a lot, like people traveling. And then folks in any of the research sections, as well as docents, really dived into I learn so much when I'm here. I love educating people, as we'd assume, you know, docents. Rangers fall into that category a lot too, mentioning like, I like, you know, sharing what the rules are and helping enforce them. And it teaches people like, don't ride your bikes on the trails because here's how it impacts the environment. Those are the two biggest things that stick out to me. I'm really curious if there's other trends, because I'm sure you all, as you talk to other volunteers, experience differences as well. But yeah, such a great question. Back to my slide too, so I'm not freaking y'all out with the software. It's kind of a lot. We can go back if you wanna, but.
For the volunteers in the room, I'm just wondering, did this reflect you completely? Is there anything missing or that you want to add? Yes, no.
It's either a really good sign.
Speak for all volunteers, I think, right? I wasn't surprised okay, that.
Yeah.
Broad remark, it all rang true. I'm not sure what else to say. I'd be very interested to see how this compared to a similar survey at any one of the other 29 reserves.
Absolutely. I wonder the same thing, and it'll be interesting, I think, with that other survey, because there were definitely some services that didn't really show up at all in our survey, things with like associated with like cultural heritage or indigenous heritage didn't show up. It doesn't mean it's not present, but like in other areas, are those influences more present? I agree. Yeah. Yes.
I promise we didn't plan this, even though we looked at it. So the other survey that's gonna span like 5 different reserves, is that like the same exact kind of questionnaire as you sent out? Like, did you pull from their study design to design yours, or is it just a coincidence that this study is going on at a similar time?
I don't think it's a coincidence. So like there's a lot of pieces. It's not the same survey. When I visited in January, they were like, hey girl, we have this crazy idea. And I said, I'm in. At that time was also like I believe one of the first full research meetings for that project that I got to sit in on, which was really neat, Zoom call. So they had done a reserve system-wide assessment of cultural ecosystem services at a few reserves for anybody, like anybody who filled out the survey. Now they wanted to narrow that and look specifically at volunteers. I think I'm getting this story right. Anybody speak up if I'm like really messing this up. They were like, okay, a lot of reserves have this really strong volunteer population. We want to look at that specifically. That full group, yes.
Yeah, you're getting it right, the bottom.
Thank God.
System is a proposal that is into the science collaborative with funding, and Lynn is the representative from the reserve. We just haven't heard that if it's been funded.
I see.
But the first project looked at many different cultural ecosystem services and had 5 reserves. And what rose to the top with interest was, why don't we change we forgot it, like we said, into volunteers? So they wrote a proposal to study this aspect of volunteerism across the system. Okay, so we're still thinking about.
Yes. All very glad I wasn't messing up that progression too bad. But yeah, it was, might have similarities, but with such a big team, maybe it's a more extensive survey, things like that. Yeah, in the back.
So generally, yes, to your question, it does reflect a lot of what I feel about, so everybody feels a little different. But one question I had was, you mentioned that sense of place was one of the categories that didn't have anything significant in the survey. I don't want to calculate it properly, so you didn't touch upon it. But maybe think, these are national research reserve, so it's all coastal, not very area. But what how it compares to, say, inland reserves, and whether or not that creates a different culture, or is that study not been done?
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. And I think that it could be more influential, like a place on the water, an estuarine environment. There's a location, I believe, like on Lake Superior. Maybe that's a little bit more influential to more inland areas because they're like, oh wow, water. Yeah, thank God. Yeah, and it wasn't that, so I'll back up a little bit. Whew, sorry if you get dizzy looking at these things. Back to the original. Sense of place definitely came up a bit in surveys, but the relationship piece didn't seem to be as clear here. So like in this line here where we see sense of place and then we follow along, there's nothing like standing out super strongly in the relationships category. There are a few pieces where we see like overlap. But yeah, and for a lot of people, the sense of place piece was pretty like straight shot. This place is important and special to me, which is wonderful. But it didn't really branch out into too much more than that from our surveys. Yeah.
Have any categories that were existence value, like people that come here that just value that this place exists?
Yes, we did. Let me make sure I get the name of that right. Get back into it. In our custom codes, that's a CES that has been like defined, just intrinsic value, and we defined it as, maybe if I can pull it up, the value nature has for its own sake. The idea that nature has value even if it doesn't benefit us is how it's defined. So yeah, that came up a little bit. And if you look where my mouse is, there were 6 instances of that code. Which probably is due to, I'm sure the intrinsic value is there for all of the volunteers in some way, but it wasn't directly stated because our questions were like, what benefits do you get from being here? Why do you love it here? So it leads kind of into those answers that are like, here are the benefits. And some people did say, I just love it just because, you know, it's an incredible thing. But yeah, great question.
But that's hard to do also ask that along the lines of this exists in opposition to development. And that this place is here and there are other parts of Wells.
Yeah, I've had that conversation with a few people.
Yeah.
You don't know. visitors, maybe if you're one of our volunteers also, and so when. We were talking, he had the question about kind of sense of place, I was thinking the thing that would have a relation to that would be just existence.
Yeah.
It's like, they like that the place exists and they like that they identify, they are a part of it. But I have had that conversation with people that were like, we're so glad that it was preserved, years and years ago, and it's not just a bunch of condominiums. They're seeing all the development happening probably right now everywhere else. I know I see it on my right north on Route 1. And I'm like, glad it's not that real here at least. At least there's that.
Yeah.
Sure the wildlife appreciate it too.
That's super interesting. Yeah.
What makes you curious enough about this subject to write your senior thesis on it? And what's driving your interest in volunteers and cultural services?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you for asking. There's a few different pieces. I think the biggest for me touches on something you mentioned. Part of this wasn't a shock to me. I, as a nature lover, know that nature gives me so many awesome benefits. I study it, I love it, I have loved it. So when I see like it benefits my well-being, I go, well, yeah, I know that, but we can't be sure that we know that until we really have the research to back it up. And that's obviously like a huge long-term thing to have enough research to confidently say this is true. So to be a small piece of that discovery, I guess, knowing that the things I feel about nature are really true in other people's lives is a really beautiful thing. That's like my biggest reason, I would say. And then exploring the way this can have implications in a lot of different people's lives. I've talked with Chris and Suzanne about this a lot. My interest in exploring the progression of human well-being as our life expectancy increases. This was something that Chris totally got me on way back in January, and I've been super into it. As our medical training and our life expectancy has increased exponentially, our social systems and our economic systems haven't really caught up to that improvement. So we have all these people living a lot longer, but not like really having the ability or the resources given them to do anything with it. Programs like this, with volunteers especially, we've seen in the data, do contribute to that. In retirement, I see all these awesome benefits. So that's a really interesting, like just personal research interest of mine that I see reflected in this data. If that answers your question enough, sorry, that was a little long-winded, but definitely lights my environmental interest fire. I'm like, yes, I love it.
As a volunteer, the fact that you even, send out these surveys and want to know how we feel and how it can be improved is very heartwarming. I mean, how many people, willing to volunteer to get a thank you? And I just think it really just shows how much the reserve cares and other reserves by doing the survey and actually trying to figure out what can be done to help make our volunteer experience even better. And I just wanted to thank you for that. And I had another question, but it's more personal for you. That what are your aspirations after you get out of college? Do you have a thought on where you want to be, or?
Yes, great question. First, I agree totally. I think it's a beautiful thing that the team here supports and appreciates you all as much as they should. It's really awesome. And to answer your question, a little bit, I guess, the general picture idea that I have, I plan to get a master's degree, hopefully in environmental education. And long term, I'm really interested in curriculum development and like developing outreach programs for an organization. That's very broad. I don't really have like a long-term, like specific role that I'd like, but I really love creating educational materials, working with people, especially if I can combine those two things into a job, that would be my dream. Right. And this was like, my gosh, I saw that research proposal and I was like, whoop, sending an email. But yeah, that's, I guess, kind of what I'm looking into right now. Yes.
Congratulations on 92 of 127.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
There's a difference or weighted responses. If you were a volunteer who's been here for a year, you volunteer, been here 7 to 9, 16, 20 plus. Are the values that you showed us, are those things that are some of those values accumulated over time, or as soon as you walk through the door, you pick it up?
Mm-hmm. Just so I'm like, wait, I can flip back to the, oh, wait. So I don't fly back. Back to this pie chart. Is your question? Just so I'm understanding the question right. It was like what defined how long they had been here and how they answered the question. I think one of the tough parts about like survey responses is we don't know for sure if some people answered it in like, I've been here for 20 years because I volunteered for 5 years and then I took a break and then I came back. But I would say in general, it's up to the person to define it, how they envision how long they've been here. If that's the question, am I answering it right? Maybe, or is there differences in results?
You have an impressive list of the way you go, the responses, and well, someone use your example of sense of place. Do people have a set of this feeling of the importance of a sense of place because they've been here for a very long time, or because they just walked on the property, or maybe that's not what?
Yeah.
That's what.
No, so that was on me. Such a great question. Yes. Something I'm also going to look into, similar to like, do the volunteer roles have a difference? Does volunteer, I guess, length of service also create that difference? I don't know is like my best answer for that. I haven't looked into those differences yet. But I do think it's something really interesting. And I really like the comment, like sometimes newer people find things more important because they're like, I just got here. It's so special, or it's so special because it's been a part of my life for this long. Yeah, I haven't looked into those differences yet, but it's something that with more time, I really want to dive into because some of these people have been here for an incredible length of time, which is really impressive and I think should be given some attention. Yes, thank you all. You're fine.